Good evening, and welcome to the CUNY Graduate Center. I'm Josh Brumberg, president of the Graduate Center, and I'm delighted to see many of you here with us in person, as well as those joining us on the live stream for tonight's program, The Wounded Generation, Coming Home After World War II. This is exactly the kind of conversation we care about at the Graduate Center and our associated Advanced Science Research Center, bringing scholarship to a broad audience and taking a closer look at moments in history we think we understand, but it turns out we might not fully. The Graduate Center is CUNY's primary doctoral granting institution. Our students take the knowledge they learn in seminar rooms and laboratories to the over 120,000 CUNY undergraduate students they teach each year. We are committed not only to producing new knowledge, but to sharing it widely so that it can make a meaningful impact. Tonight's topic asks us to look again at the years after World War II, a period often wrapped in hagiography. But as we will learn, that familiar story glosses over much. In his new book, David Nasaw shows us a post-war America marked not only by celebration, but also by trauma, dislocation, and disenfranchisement. It is a powerful reframing of a moment many of us think we knew, and it feels especially relevant now because it reminds us that war always wounds, even when we are the quote-unquote victors. Joining us tonight is David Nasaw, the Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. Distinguished Professor of History Emeritus at the Graduate Center and one of our most respected historians and biographers. He is the author of the acclaimed biographies of William Randolph Hearst, Andrew Carnegie, and Joseph P. Kennedy. His book on Kennedy, The Patriarch, was named one of the New York Times best books of the year and was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. His biography of Andrew Carnegie was also a Pulitzer finalist and won the New York Historical Society's American History Book Prize. The Chief, his book about William Randolph Hearst, received the Bancroft Prize. At the Graduate Center, he has been a dedicated teacher and mentor, working with students who have gone on to make their own contributions to scholarship and public life. He'll be joined in conversation by Frank Rich, who brings extensive experience in journalism, criticism, and storytelling to tonight's discussion. A writer at large for New York Magazine, he was previously chief drama critic and an opinion columnist for the New York Times. He has also worked extensively in film and television, serving as an executive producer on HBO's Veep and Succession, among other projects. His books include The Greatest Story Ever Told, The Decline and Fall of Truth from 9/11 to Katrina, and the memoir Ghostlight. His work has received multiple Emmy, Peabody, and Golden Globe Awards, as well as a Producers Guild Award. He has twice been a Pulitzer Prize finalist. Thank you, as always, to Karen Sander and the public program team for planning and organizing this evening's event. And thank you all for being with us tonight in person and on the live stream. Now, please join me in welcoming Frank Rich and David Nasaw.
Thanks for coming. I'm delighted to be here with David. I've been a fan of your writing since before we met. We've known each other in relatively recent years, but I remember the first book of yours I read was called Going Out, and it was a sort of cultural study about how nightlife changed, and with it in America, and particularly New York, as I recall, and with it, the roles of women, the roles of all sorts of cultural norms changed. And it's interesting that there's even a through line, in a way, from that book through everything you've written, including this book, which would seem to be about a much different subject. I'm curious why you chose to write this book. I should remind people who don't know that your previous book, published not that long ago, The Last Million, was about the displaced, the disowned, the stateless refugees after the war. And this book, in a way, is the same story, but it's about Americans who did come back and still were displaced, often disowned, treated shabbily. What do you see that direct connection between the two? Was it kind of a continuous journey for you? I hate that word journey, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. If I were younger, there'd be a third book, a trilogy. But From this point on, I'm only writing blurbs.
I know that feeling.
Yeah, the last million taught me that my tribe, my vocation, we historians have done a miserable job on the post-war period. We jump from the end of World War II to the Cold War, to Korea. And we have very little interest, we have had very little interest or understanding of the post-war period, 1945 to Korea and to Eisenhower. One of the things I learned in doing the last million that continues here, and it is a lesson that we should all take to heart, is wars do not end with peace treaties. The wounds of war, the dislocations of war, the injuries and the disabilities of war continue far past the moment when peace is proclaimed and the soldiers take off their uniforms. In the last million, I talked about the million refugees from Eastern Europe, including 250,000 Jews, who, when the war was over, didn't, look at the sunshine and say, wow. They were herded into displaced persons camps behind barbed wire, where they stayed 3, 4, 5 years. In the wounded generation, I look at the same time period, 1945 to 1950, and I talk about the war, the soldiers, the sailors, the WACs, the airboys brought home with them. They brought the war home with them in body, mind, soul, spirit. And the civilians, their parents, their children, their wives, their former employees, their friends, were all displaced when the war was over. We forget how long this war went on. And we forget that more than 16 million men and women fought. More than 1/3 of all the men 18 to 45 in this country fought in this war. So yes, there is continuity, and it's intentional.
It's a very, very rich book, and we can't obviously go through all of it tonight. I want to zero in on, try to dig a little deeply into a few areas, but it reveals so much that just no one's thought about or written about, and connects a lot of things together. And looking through it, I felt there were sort of 2 or 3 main aspects to it, which don't do it justice to reduce it to 3. But one is PTSD, the fact that many, many people who fought became mentally ill. They were not diagnosed. They were not treated. The disease didn't even have a name for decades. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the second overarching theme is all the worst inequities towards Black people, women, gay people were perpetrated by the war. In some ways, there are some bright spots, but basically compounded by the war, and even more horrifyingly, were continued after the war supposedly ended, when, just to take one random example, lynching actually went up in the South, not just the South, after American Blacks, with often humiliating circumstances or treated so poorly, fought for their country. The third thing that really grabs me, it all grabs me, but is that there really has been, as we've already has already been alluded to, a continuing culture war isn't the right phrase, but cultural battle to define what this war was about. We've, the greatest generation and all that. We'll get to that because I think one of the reasons why this history hasn't been written in the depth that you've brought to it all this time is because it's hard. You had to be brave as a writer, and you also had to have an original turn of mind to get past those cliches, that have dominated discourse about the war since, VE Day and VJ Day. I want to start with the racism because it's such an important part of the book, but also it's so sobering. I just wrote down, a few things, but these are just a few random facts or examples that are from the book, that from 1941 to 46, at least 28 active duty Black soldiers lost their lives in the United States for refusing to submit to Jim Crow humiliations. Hundreds more suffered non-fatal gunshot wounds, imprisonment in civilian jails, and were given sentences on chain gangs. Now we're talking about, after the war in that case. Blacks were denied GI Bill benefits, social welfare programs, housing, a lot of this in the beginning, jobs, a lot of this was unsatisfactory for all veterans, but they got the worst of it more than Blacks, obviously. Explain what a blue discharge is. Blue discharge in the service meant what? Remind me. It means for unsavory behavior.
The blue discharge was invented because the Army, it took too much time to do court-martials. Court-martial was a legal proceeding. And when the Army wanted to get rid of somebody, they gave them what was neither an honorable nor dishonorable discharge. They called it a blue discharge because of the paper that was on it. And the guys who got these discharges believed, and the women, believed that because it was not a dishonorable discharge, they would be able to get GI Bill benefits when they came back.
So as of June of 1945, Black GIs received 22% of blue discharges, though they comprised less than 10% of military personnel. I want to talk about this in general. But there's one sort of vaguely positive thing that you point out, that in some ways the military also undermined white supremacy, and that wasn't their intention, but that's what happened. So I'd be grateful if you talk about some of this and string it together better than I can, and things that particularly are striking to you about this quite big story here.
It's a complicated story. The Southern citizens, police, politicians, senators, members of the House of Representatives, people in the executive branch, they were torn. They didn't want Blacks from the South, and 2/3 of the soldiers in the military were from the South. They didn't want them to go into the Army. But on the other hand, if they didn't go into the Army, then a lot of white fathers and whites were going to have to go in. So they decided, let's let them go in, but no combat. No combat. There was this ridiculous study that was done after World War I by the military, which concluded that Blacks were not smart enough or brave enough to be in combat. So the Black soldiers and Marines and sailors served. They served meals, they removed the dead, they carried the litters with the wounded, but they drove the trucks, they built the bridges, they were in the engineering corps, they provided the food, the supplies, the ammunition. They were under fire, they were in danger throughout the entire war. And only towards the end of the war, when Marshall and Eisenhower, Marshall, the chief of staff, and Eisenhower were running out of white soldiers because so many had to remain at home to supply the Americans and the Brits and the Red Army with tanks and planes and ammunition and guns. There weren't enough soldiers. So from late 1944 on, they let blacks enter into combat units, segregated combat units. When the war was over, the black soldiers, having lived in communities from Australia to on every continent where Jim Crow was not the custom, the tradition, they learned that the white supremacy and the racism they had grown up with was not universal. All white people didn't think black people were inferior. And they began to rebel against the MPs and their officers who were from the South. And the officers and the MPs wrote home to their senators, to their congressmen, to their newspaper editors, and said, we're going to have trouble when these guys come back. So there was a preemptive attempt to make sure that as soon as the black soldiers came back, they would be put in their place. And they were put in their place. The violence was unimaginable. A lot of the soldiers who came back, their bodies had changed. They had gone off as 18-year-olds. They came back in their early 20s. They didn't fit into their clothes. They were allowed to wear their uniforms for, I think, 30 to 60 days. The black soldiers wore their uniforms because they couldn't afford a new set of clothes, and that outraged Southerners. Outraged Southerners. So, as Frank said, there was more lynching in 1946 than there had been in years. The violence was overwhelming. Men like Medgar Evers, and his brother, who wanted to register to vote, quickly learned. Hosea Williams, a lot of the future civil rights leaders came back. They wanted to change the country, but they realized that they were putting themselves and their families in danger. It took 10 years before these guys, 10 years until Montgomery and Martin Luther King and the nation had changed before they could join the civil rights movement.
And by the way, as you point out in the book, there wasn't the Emmett Till anti-lynching bill was not passed and signed until Biden signed it in 2022. Yeah. One of many instances in this book that I didn't know about, I'd like to talk about for a second, this Columbia, Tennessee riot that seems to have been covered up by history, but can you just fill people in on it a little bit? The so-called race riot in Columbia, Tennessee? There
were any number of attempts by black servicemen, by black veterans, to organize their communities to vote. And again, the white citizenry was prepared for this, and they were prepared for it with violence. Walter White and the NAACP, they went to see Truman, and they said, please, 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 make a statement about lynching. This has to stop. And Truman said, you think a president can do more than he really can? And Truman's major advisor, I'm forgetting his name now, Jacobson, he was a Jewish advisor. He had been with Roosevelt. Kai's nodding his head. Is it Jacobson? Yeah. Jacobson said, well, Mr. President, why don't you put together a commission, and the commission will report on the problems. The day after the NAACP was there, Paul Robeson brought every Hollywood star, from Orson Welles, all of them, Jimmy Cagney, they all came with Robeson. They signed a statement, and they went again and they said, President Truman, you've got to do something. And he was not as pleasant as he was with Mr. White and the NAACP. The result was that the anti-lynching bill was not signed into law until the Biden administration.
Another battlefront as the war ended and everyone came home involved, of course, issues of sex, gender, marriage, and some of this, when you read it, you think, well, of course this is the case, but I haven't seen it crystallize in this way. I was going to read just a few examples from the book. First of all, I love this figure that as many as 50 million condoms were sold or distributed free each month of the war to the armed forces. That's something I didn't know. And there were, of course, complete double standards in terms of about extramarital sex when it came to wives that that were back home. One GI wrote a buddy right after VE Day, all Germany is just one big whorehouse. And meanwhile, they're coming home to wives who at least been told to, been constantly lectured to be faithful. Obviously, people were worried that they might not be. Meanwhile, the whole change of what it meant to be a wife, by February of 1944, 1.4 million war wives worked outside the home. 1.1 million of them had children under 10 years old. A Lady Home's Journal poll found that of those who did work, 70% with children and 84% without children would rather work than stay home. Once the war ended, they'd had enough of staying home. And yet at the same time, the men came back, as you said, were different. They were different physically. They were certainly different mentally. They'd seen a lot. They were unrecognizable in some ways to their wives, but also to their children. In some cases, there was a different reaction from children who were born after they went to the front as opposed to those that they had been born before they left. And there were all these dislocations, and some women had, gone the other way. There's this incredibly poignant story you cite from the Baltimore Sun in August of 45. On the front page story, Corporal Stanley Heck, who lost his legs in Germany and whose arm was likely also to be amputated, emerged from a hospital bed in Texas, filing charges against his wife for desertion and adultery and against the man she'd been seeing for love theft. It's something so sad, poignant about it. Talk about, because and the role of women's magazines, even as they were printing polls that showed something was afoot and change was afoot, trying to enforce the old view, the pre-war view of marriage and of women's roles in society.
It was a real revolution. It didn't last very long, but it remained in the heads of the women who had worked during the war, not only worked during the war, but they had balanced the checkbook, they'd gotten the car fixed, they had overseen the plumber if there was a problem, or got the roof repaired. They did everything they were told they were incapable of doing. And they watched. They read the censored letters that, with their hints about, especially from Europe, about a lot of drinking and about how wonderful it was to liberate towns and cities, in Paris included. Life magazine, a great source for historians, wonderful source. Life magazine had photograph after photograph of GIs in Jeeps being surrounded, hugged, kissed by beautiful young women. And at home, the wives were reading this and seeing what was going on. You couldn't help it. And it was not just in every city that the GIs went through. In every town, there were these photographs, there were these stories of the women jumping on their saviors. Meantime, back in this country, there was, the women were not going to be tied down. They too had affairs, alliances, one-day stands, though they were watched over very carefully by their mother-in-laws, by the Red Cross. There were spies everywhere. It got so bad that Dear John clubs were formed all across the Pacific theaters and the European theaters, where guys talked about their suspicions about their wives. You couldn't divorce a guy while he was in the army. You had to wait for him to come home. You could tell him it's not going to work when you came home. There were more divorces in 1946 than there had ever been, and the rate of divorce did not climb that high until the 60s and 70s. You talk in your book about how people didn't get divorced in the late 40s.
When I was growing up in the 50s and early 60s, indeed, I'm from the generation, as I think, maybe it didn't apply to you, but it applied to a lot of people I knew, that everyone in the sort of the middle class, suburban-ish world I grew up in, I didn't know, when my parents got divorced, I was split up, I was in the second grade. No one I knew parents got divorced until everyone was graduating high school. Then there was this epidemic of divorce because everyone had stayed together for the alleged good of the children, and that's when it skyrocketed. There's a number of movies that you talk about and other cultural things that went on in the book. There's a movie I have never seen called Divorce that talk about, because it sounds kind of hilarious in retrospect, but it was with Kay Francis in 1945, a Hollywood movie. Talk about it.
Yeah, one of the things that in doing this book, I had to wipe away the decades of nonsense about faithful wives and heroic husbands coming back. I had to start all over again. From 1950, part of the problem was that nobody talked about the war to their children, to journalists. They didn't write about it. They wanted to forget about it. And it's not until 1984 when Peggy Noonan of the Wall Street writes this brilliant speech for Reagan. She had never met Reagan. It was 84 was the 40th anniversary of D-Day. She writes this brilliant speech. They go to Normandy. They take with them the largest press contingent that had ever been seen. Reagan gives he was a brilliant performer, brilliant speech. And there are lined up veterans in wheelchairs. 10 years later, it happens again. From 1984 to 1994, and increasing after 1994, this myth, this narrative of the veterans, the soldiers who fought the good war, they were honest, they were never cruel, they never broke the Geneva Accords, they fought the good war, they were the greatest generation. I had to put that aside and look at the sources from 1945 to 1950. I had to read the newspapers, the women's magazines, the news magazines, the glossies, look at the newsreels, and the films were unbelievable. The films got it right. The films were extraordinary from 45 to 50, 52. And one of those films, probably one of the worst, I understand why you didn't see it. One of the worst films, I don't recommend that anybody go home and try to find it. It's Divorce with Kay Francis, in which she is a divorcee, and she learns that her, a teenage lover or college lover has come home, and she travels and has money, and she travels to see him and steals him from the wife. It's clear that the guy has PTSD. The wife says, I don't know what's wrong with him. He seems happy, but he's not happy. He doesn't sleep. He has nightmares. She sweeps him away. There are the two little kids who are heartbroken. And of course, it being a Hollywood movie, it ends with the family being, reunited. But they weren't reunited. Again, in 1946, there are more divorces than there had ever been. There's this extraordinary, you mentioned this too, there's this extraordinary study that was done at Stanford of father, with one of the worst titles, Father Relations with Children of War. Father relations, what it meant was that all the fathers whose children had been raised while they were away for war, where they didn't see their kids from birth to 4 years old or from 1 to 5 years old, they came back and they never formed attachments with those kids. They formed strong attachments with the kids who were born after they got home, who they helped to raise. And those kids, observed by these Stanford psychologists in schools, did miserably in every psychological test and psychological observation. Thankfully, a lot of them later wrote books about their difficulties with their fathers. What I'm trying to say is that from 1945 to 1950, this world was turned upside down. And not the black soldiers, it took them 10 years to begin their activism for the Civil War. And it took a lot of these women, a lot of the women handed to their daughters this notion that, hey, you don't have to be a housewife. They had been locked in after the war as they were before the war. Let me just say one other thing. One woman reports that during the war, she was very happy to wear trousers. And as soon as her husband came back, she had to put away her trousers and wear frilly dresses like she had worn when she was a teenager. And that was a humiliation for her, though the husband loved it.
Continuing the movies and the psychological impact on the soldiers from the war and when they came back, and the fact that it wasn't treated. Very struck by the fact that in 1946 was when Frank Capra, his first movie after the war, made It's a Wonderful Life. And I guess I had forgotten that it was a flop, that it was only rediscovered. It lost money, it didn't make back its investment, and it was only discovered when television came in and it became a Christmas movie, more than a decade later. That same year, of course, was William Wyler's The Best Years of Our Lives, which I still think is a towering film. It hasn't dated at all, which really tried to deal with what was going on and was a success. I mean, it was a commercial and critical success. But meanwhile, there were also these movies that are sort of less well remembered that you talk about that in a different way from the delicate and sophisticated way Wyler did it, dug into the idea that essentially veterans were crazy. They were criminals. You should be frightened of them. And they were very commercially successful. There were quite a lot of them. Something I had never thought about. If you don't mind talking about that a bit, it's quite something.
It was not just the films. It was the newspapers and the magazines that talked about the dangerous veterans. What they said over and over and over again was, these guys have been away for 4 years and they learned how to kill. And they've been in male-only barracks and communities, and they've taken orders, and they've learned how to kill. And they've learned how to use weapons. There was this big movement. The Army let everybody bring back a souvenir. They brought back swords from the Pacific and Lugers from Europe. And the police chief it wasn't the police chief, it was the attorney general in California, called together all the law enforcement people. And he said, you've got to be very careful because they've got all these weapons they're bringing home with them. Hoover talked about the dangers. There were two dangers. One, all the teenagers who had grown up without fathers were going to be wild and reckless. And the veterans were going to come home and they were going to be wild and reckless. One of the women's magazines, I forget which, had a story that was, will he be changed? And the answer was yes. There was another story in the Saturday Evening Post, maybe, by a former soldier who talked about a court case where a young veteran had shot a dog. And everybody was outraged by this. What had happened? And they brought the young soldier to court. And he said, look, I don't know what happened. I just blanked out. I heard this noise. I got scared. I turned around and I shot him. And Arch Souter, who was the veteran who wrote this piece, said this time it was a dog. But what if it was a human being? And then there are the movies. I brought my cheat sheet with me.
Good.
I'll Be Seeing You, where Joseph Cotton has PTSD. He calls it psychoneurosis. Since You Went Away, Joseph Cotton again, with Shirley Temple and Claudette Colbert, try to make life possible, waiting, knowing, when you begin to watch the movie that somebody's going to die, and you're worried that it's going to be Claudette Colbert's husband, but it's not. It's the gardener's son, so that's okay. In Pride of the Marines, John Garfield comes home blind, and of course learns to see. Blue Dahlia, Alan Ladd comes home, and his wife says, he walks into a party, a big party. His wife is drunk and hanging on to a man. And he says, what are you doing? And she said, what do you think I'm doing? Do you think I just sat in a chair while you were away? I can go on until the end of time. Robert Mitchum goes nuts, and his friend Guy Madison tries to help him but can't. Truckline Cafe, Marlon Brando's first. This is by Max. Did you ever know about this one?
I actually wrote about this I wrote a book
you?
about the set designer of Boris Harrison 40 years ago, and of course, it was Marlon Brando's first role. Kazan directed. It was a play by Maxwell Anderson. It lasted like 2 weeks on Broadway.
13 performances.
And yet. And explain what the story was.
Marlon Brando. This gets to Broadway. Marlon Brando is a veteran. He comes home. He finds his wife has been unfaithful. He kills her and dumps her in the river or swamp or someplace. His friend comes home, and his friend's wife, another habitué of the Trunkline Cafe, the friend finds his wife has been unfaithful. The wife thought the husband was dead, and when she finds out he's alive, she runs away, and the second husband tries to find the wife. Streetcar Named Desire has another Marlon Brando, a crazy, insane.
And Kazan cast him as Kowalski because of the experience a year or two earlier with Truckline Cafe.
And he wrote this because Kazan was then living with Pancho, who was a PTSD-addled, violent veteran.
Williams was with Pancho.
Williams was with Pancho. And then Bogart. Bogart is an Avenger in Dead Reckoning, Key Largo, In a Lonely Place. Robert Ryan causes havoc in Crossfire and The Act of Violence.
And also the relatively early pre-Kurt Vonnegut, much earlier literary examples. I had completely forgotten, not having read Salinger's stories in years, that Seymour Glass, who kills himself in A Perfect Day for Banana Fish, was a veteran. I'd completely blanked out on that. And I through the years read a lot. I really like Ross MacDonald, pseudonym for Ken Millar, a sort of Raymond Chandler-like Southern California detective novelist. I'd forgotten that his first books were right after the war, and also had a veteran at the center of them, and
Mickey Spillane.
Mickey
Spillane's character, Mickey Spillane's character in I, the Jury. Mickey, the veteran, comes back and he says, I'm going to take care of, the world has gone crazy while I was away. There are all these rich people who are creating havoc. Policeman says, I'll take care of it, his friend. And the Mickey Spillane character, I forget his name, says, no, I'll take care of it. And the title of the book is I, the Jury.
in fact, there wasn't this huge crime wave, right, among veterans. Another big component of this that I haven't seen discussed before was alcoholism. And I know this affected your father, who was in the war, and also I was fascinated to see that it played a role, like sort of like a bank shot, in the poet Frank O'Hara's death after he was hit by a taxi in Fire Island, some years after the war. Could you talk about that? Why was there so much alcoholism? About your father, perhaps, and the Frank O'Hara story I found really interesting too.
Yeah, the guys who came back with PTSD tried to get help from the VA. The VA didn't know what to do with them. Nobody knew what to do with them. The neo-Freudians had this notion that there was no such thing as PTSD. If you came back and you said, I'm really upset because I felt helpless all around me, my best friends were being killed, the psychiatrist, this happens in John Huston's Let There Be Light, which is about a psychiatric hospital. The psychiatrist would say, well, did you ever feel helpless when you were an infant, a child? And the soldier would say, yeah, my mother went away for a vacation. I felt terrible. And the psychiatrist would say, well, that's the underlying trauma. That's what we got to work on. When PTSD got really bad, and when the family brought the veteran to the hospital and said, you got to do something with this guy. If they couldn't take care of him or help him within 3 to 4 months, they gave him shock therapy. And the shock treatment was ridiculous because there was no, shock treatment can work in today, but it requires a protocols and procedures and timing. They just shocked these guys. And you can see that again in Let There Be Light. And when shock treatment didn't work, and it never did, these guys were given, and women were given, lobotomies. So they quickly learned that they weren't going to get any help with their nightmares, with their rages, with their depression, with their anxieties, with their feeling, they carried this anxiety, this fear, this disorder, this alienation with them, that the best way to cure it was to get drunk every night. My father came home from the war, and I learned a lot of this while I was writing the book from my brother, who's 2 years younger, and spent more time with my father while I was away at college. My father, when he came home, had on his bedside table a bottle of scotch, J&B, Jewish booze. It's true. So that when he woke up in the morning, he could have his scotch. When I was, I think, 5 years old, 4 years old, my brother was 1 or 2, my father got up in the morning and he found my mother in our apartment in Tudor City, which was then a middle-class neighborhood with a lot of veterans. He found the boys, my brother and I, all dressed up, and my mother with a suitcase. And he said, what's going on? She said, I can't live with you anymore. And he said, what do you want me to do? And she said, stop drinking. And he was one of these miraculous veterans who stopped drinking. at Passover, he had grape juice with the kids. He wouldn't eat rum cake. He'd never had a drink the rest of his life. But the war didn't go away. The underlying anxieties didn't go away. When I was a teenager, I went to borrow a pair of socks from his sock drawer, and I found what looked like a little barrel full of little pills. And it didn't register till my brother told me that he took heavy sedatives to get to sleep at night. He couldn't sleep without them. And the sedatives were so strong that he had to take speed when he got up in the morning and through the rest of the day. He died when he was 61 of heart condition that the VA said was service-related. I never knew what happened to him because, like so many other veterans, he did not talk about the war. Tell the story of your stepfather.
Frank O'Hara.
Oh, yeah.
Was in the service, fought in the war, and became an alcoholic. And when he was, died, way too young, when he was hit in Fire Island, just hit by a taxi, his partner said that he might have lived had, I guess it was his liver was so damaged from the alcoholism that the injuries affected him in an atypical way, that the injuries of this unfortunate car accident, and it killed him.
O'Hara was in the Navy, and when he was in training in the Navy, he wrote home to his mother and father. He said, "There's a lot of drinking going on here. I've learned to drink." He said, "But don't worry, I've got it under control." Well, he never had it under control, and he drank the rest of his life to the point where his liver was shot. If he hadn't been run over, he would have died of cirrhosis or some other liver disease.
Another example in the book is the actor and all-around theater person, Ossie Davis, who was had terrible problems with alcoholism, as you recount in the book. And actually, after the war, the first play he did, which ran for quite a while, I think on the road as well as New York, with Ruby Dee, another great actress who became his wife, he was drunk at every performance. And then kind of, like your father, quit, and in his case, went on to live much longer and have a great career. There's so much to talk about. I know we're starting to run out of time. Not quite. In the post-war economic situation for veterans was horrible. In fact, as you say, that there was no housing. There's a vivid account from the Milwaukee Journal of a family of 5, a veteran, his wife, and 3 daughters, literally holding up placards in downtown Milwaukee begging for housing. There was no housing. When housing was belatedly built, or the government started to get involved, blacks were not beneficiaries, and conservatives in Congress, including Joe McCarthy, as if he didn't do enough other damage, kept trying to kill housing programs. And when housing was built, like Levittown or Stuyvesant Town in New York, blacks were not allowed in. Black veterans were not allowed in. As you put it, it was, but ultimately, a welfare state was created out of this tragedy, even though it took to the early 50s, for instance, for housing to stabilize over 10 years. That became a kind of unintentional change in national social policy through the war that is a positive thing. One other thing I just wanted to toss in here, and then I want to also go to the whole battle over the greatest generation. The GI Bill, which is an incredible thing, although again, black veterans had trouble getting access to it. But among the people that it aided, a lot of people, it never occurred to me, like Joseph Heller and Norman Mailer, but Rauschenberg, Lichtenstein, Ellsworth Kelly, Cy Twombly, and then jazz musicians like Coltrane and Brubeck, Tito Puente. I'm fascinated by the fact that because basically big bands collapsed during the war for commercial reasons, had nothing to do with any of this, but all these terrific musicians who had played in them, Coltrane would be an example, they were suddenly available for other things. And the GI Bill introduced them, jazz players, to classical music, and sort of began the post-war elevation of jazz into a different and in some ways more sophisticated art form. And then the number of actors, on the GI Bill, Tony Curtis, Jason Robards, Don Rickles, who was trained as an actor, Walter Matthau, and the American Theater Wing under the GI Bill, they took in veterans. And here was the faculty. Agnes DeMille ran the dance department. Jerry Robbins ran modern dance. Lincoln Kirsten ran ballet, and it was quite amazing. But I don't know if we have time to go to all the economic indignities after the war. But is there anything I didn't hit on there that we should say about it?
What happens is the GI Bill is written for two reasons. One, Congress wants to thank the GIs. But more importantly, Congress wants to make sure that there's no civil war when the veterans come back, as it happened in Italy after World War I, in Germany after World War I, and threatened with the bonus marchers after World War I in the United States. The GI Bill is intended, and its major purpose is to make sure that these guys don't cause trouble. How do you keep them out of trouble? Well, you give them a year of special unemployment insurance so they don't have to go looking for a job. And then, because it's going to take time to reconvert the economy from war to peace, you send them to college. And if they don't want to go to college, they can go to vocational school. We think about the GI Bill as college, but only 2.2 of the 8 million who take advantage of the GI Bill go to college. Most of them go to vocational school. What's more important than what they learn at vocational school, most of them learn nothing. It's a real scam. But they get an allowance to go to school. Their tuition is paid, and they get a living allowance, which is better than they could get if they tried to find a job. So what happens? The United States of America puts together the most generous social welfare program any nation has seen. Historians talk about the Beveridge Plan. Well, what went on in this country was much more generous than what went on in the United Kingdom. It was extraordinary. And why? Why? Because I'm going to bore you with just some figures. National defense spending in 1945 was $83 billion. It goes down to $9 billion in 1948. Where does the money go? It goes to the vets. Spending on vets goes from $110 million in 1945 to $6.3 billion in 1947 to $8.8 billion in 1950. The defense budget becomes a social welfare budget with a big but. What's the big but? It's for white males who make up 90% of the veterans who come back. The bill is written, the GI Bill is written. Roosevelt knows that in order to get support, he's got to have the Southern Democrats and the Midwestern Republicans. So what does he do? They write a bill where the federal government throws money at the states decide how to spend it. And the states, the 13 states that bar integration in higher education and every other form of education, the black veterans can't get into the historically black colleges, okay? What about mortgages? Well, the GI Bill provides a mortgage guarantee. What does that mean? You gotta have a mortgage first. If you're a WAC or a WAVE or woman veteran or black veteran, try going into your bank and saying, I want a mortgage. You're gonna be turned away within, 3 minutes. Without the mortgage, you can't get the mortgage guarantee. And what does that mean? That means that white veterans like my father, who make use of the GI Bill, they're given capital at a moment in time where every dollar that goes to their mortgage guarantee, right, grows through the 50s and the 60s and enables them to send me and my brother to college. Black veterans, it doesn't happen. And the wealth gap between black and white, which had begun to shrink a little during the war, expands, and it affects generations to come.
It's amazing. One thing unrelated directly to the GI Bill that also is just really striking is you had black Americans fighting in the war who had, before the war, had, from the Deep South, from agrarian backgrounds, who learned and mastered incredible specialized skills in the war, technical skills, any kind of skill you can imagine, and then still couldn't get jobs in those fields, even though they'd served and they'd learned those skills protecting their country.
The last word, and I hate to leave on a down subject, but the only thing that the Veterans Administration learned was that the way to lessen the pain that veterans of PTSD from Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Korea, and the few that are left from World War II was to have group therapy sessions led by a veteran. There were research projects that were underway using psychedelic drugs, all sorts of drugs, to see if that would work. The research projects have been curtailed. The VA has begun to outsource its treatment to community centers that are run by insurance companies, including United Health. And the one possible ameliorating treatment, which are these group therapy sessions, are being dramatically cut back. It is one of the, our veterans deserve, God knows, whatever war they fought in, whether they were drafted, whether they were enlisted, they deserve the care that used to be provided by the VA, which with all its problems had a hospital series, a hospital program, and it had trained psychiatrists, doctors, surgeons who cared and worked and who have been laid off and not replaced. So it's one of the things that I hope will receive more attention as we approach elections in the midterms and the next presidential election.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming.